So what John didn't mention is I've most of my career has been with the various land trusts in this New Hampshire, Vermont area, mainly in Vermont. So I've been working in the forest from both an ecological as well as a forestry perspective during that time. So I'm going to not try to do a complete ecology of the northern hardwood forest because that would be way too much. And so Bill and I decided to focus on kind of the pieces of ecology that are most relevant, that we thought were most directly relevant to the carbon aspects of this. And then when we get into discussion, if there are other parts of ecology of the northern hardwood forest, we can go into that. So starting is how much above ground carbon, not in this map is just to show that it's not evenly distributed across the landscape. And this is the parts of New England. And you'll see that there, some of them you would expect, the Adirondacks, but in general, these are very carbon rich forests that we are sitting in the middle of. And I expand that to give you a sense of the global carbon density. And so the deepness of the green is the areas where there's the most carbon. And this is a globally significant forest that we live in. And one of the pieces that people rarely understand is that we live in this forest, and yet it is just as important as some of the other forests there are. And will continue under climate change to be one of the places where the convergence of the changes in water and all of that will continue to support a very carbon dense forest here. And that's relevant because as you decide your strategies between carbon and non-carbon type of management, where you want to do the store the most carbon is where it's most dense, and where you want to harvest is often in places where there's less. This is just a touching on pieces of some of the challenges that are going to be facing these forests, and that's a whole nother talk of how the invasive species may change, just the growing cycle will be changing. How is drought going to be part of the picture, because that is in our projections. We'll have plenty of adequate water, but drought is going to have effects. This is just a placeholder to say that it's not all just what we've had in the past. It's not going to be the same. And that's really important because a lot of forestry is trying to project and predict what's going to happen over long time periods. And that's going to get more difficult. So the two strategies that we focus on, active management versus reserves, each bring benefits to that. This is just a short piece of, just talks about sustainable forest management means that you're maintaining the capacity of forest products, but while at the same time maintaining ecological biodiversity elements. One of the things that gets missed is that is not a one-for-one of how much is growing versus how much you're harvesting. If you're doing that, you're locking the forest in whatever condition it is right now. And so that if in general, our forests are understocked, and so that they have room to recover, and so that you're, where you are and what you're taking out versus what you're storing are become very important. And the what people don't often realize is how much the forests are part of mitigating, or could be mitigating, the production of atmospheric carbon dioxide, and it's around 30%. And the two pieces of ways that you use forest as a mitigation strategy by storing carbon, you can lengthen, the two most effective ways are lengthening the time between harvests or setting aside them completely as reserves. And the next few slides will talk about how those are a little different, and some of the common perception of how reserves fit into that picture it's evolving. I think more and more people are understanding that how important those become, but we're also understanding more and more how when you harvest, the timing and stuff becomes very important. We start with just, this is based on modeling, but through observation, it's based on a large, ecosystem type of modeling. For Oregon, afforestation is the planting of trees. So that strategy you can see is much less than if you were, what's reforestation is the recovery of a forest that was recently a forest. Afforestation is growing them from where it was like a pasture or something. So those create different amounts. And then reduced harvest, and in this model, they arbitrarily kind of increase in intervals to 80 years and reduce the harvest on federal lands by half. But it shows that you get huge differences. What I think is more important is to bring it into what happens in our forests. And so the common perception, and this is one way of looking at it, is the percentage of volume growth that happens in each of the 20-year intervals. And this is just as, they're kind of the young grow fast. And that actually translates into something that I want to touch on. And if people want to discuss it more, we can do that in the questions. But there's a lot of focus right now by some people that the best strategy is to make sure that you have lots of young forests growing quickly. And the flaw in that is that it's a measurement from the forestry world, not the ecology world, that is measuring the rate of diameter change in the bole and is not looking at the whole tree. And so part of this, what I would say one of the biggest disagreements in how to manage for carbon is around this aspect. And I want to, Bill and I wanted to emphasize what's really going on in these 20-year periods is vastly different because it's the actual, if you measure the actual volume growth, not a rate, not a percentage, your trees that are 160 years old are still putting on more carbon than they stand at 50 years of age. So they're putting on carbon, large amounts of it, even as they're very old. And this is based on white pines, actual measurements over long periods of time. And this is not hypothetical any longer. These are more and more measurements are being done. This is showing it in a way that's probably a little easier to understand, is that it accumulates over time. I thought this was anyway. The density, the cumulative carbon continues to go up, even at the 150 years. But this is what's happening in terms of numbers of trees. And so everybody kind of intuitively thinks, well, trees are dying, therefore you're not getting carbon. But if you actually look at what's happening in the stand, it continues to go up. And that is really the heart and soul of what's called proforestation, or setting aside as reserves, where you're just going to let it be a wild forest, that the carbon keeps going up. And people might argue, well, 150 years of age isn't that old. Well, that happens to be the site there. But if you go to the Adirondacks, there you get trees that are much older, and you get the same data, the total. And in this case, it's the above ground carbon only. So the soil is also doing this, but the total is continuing to go up even at 400 years of age. And this is where the two strategies are really important to understand, and how much total carbon that you get by each of them is very different. Another way of looking at it is, what is the equivalent of one tree? This is just to try and get people to visualize that a very large tree stores a lot of carbon. And what people don't realize is how much that the harvesting, as we do business as normal right now, is in the total forest carbon loss. And this circle shows you, the natural processes of fire, insects, and even the conversion of forest is relatively small to what's happening on a global scale in the US from a harvesting perspective. The other really important line in this, I think, is that carbon sink has been reduced by 42%. In my first slide, when I looked at the region, it's roughly half of its total percentage that it could accumulate over time. So there's a lot of room for a lot of storage of a lot of carbon. We don't know everything that climate change is going to bring in terms of are the forests going to grow the same way, but the projections are that in our area, it's probably a safe bet that it's going to be similar. The other argument that comes up, and here's where I get a little bit off of the ecology part of things, but well, the wood products end up storing carbon. Well, this is a study that looked at what was happening in 3 states over a long period of time. There are other studies. This is just illustrative of the type of things that we're finding is that the carbon we harvest actually doesn't stay very long in stored products. And as a slight aside, if you want that, things like toilet paper shouldn't be made out of trees because that's taking wood that's very old and turning into something that goes immediately into the atmosphere. You want to take things, that type of product out of grass or bamboo would probably be the most likely because the growth cycle is very different. So how do we get big trees? You just let them grow. No high technology, no nothing. It's 30% of what the world is emitting. The trees could, in theory, handle a large amount of that. They accumulate it, as well as increasing the biodiversity in older forests, have a higher rate of amount of biodiversity. Again, if we want to talk about that in the discussion stage, we can. Because a lot of people think, oh, they get old. Well, the squeeze point and the low point of biodiversity is about 100 years to 120 years. That's what we have a lot of 80 to 120-year-old forests. When you get to 150, 160, 200-year-old forests, the picture is vastly different. And they accumulate the most carbon over time if you just grow them. Harvesting is always going to do a little less. And you've got to look at it. It's in the limbs, the soil, the trunk. It's simply a volume measurement based on how many leaf area there is. Half of the carbon sits in 1% of the trees. That's the role of these big trees is immense, and we're only just realizing that. This last slide, or next to last slide, is again a little bit out of ecology, but for the topic tonight, Bill and I thought it was important to talk about how the price of carbon could affect management decisions. So this is solely economic modeling. So there's no truth in this whatsoever. What you use is a discount rate that vastly affects these curves. But the concept is sound, is that if you've got really low prices of carbon, which right now the voluntary market is way down here, most of your value is in timber. And you've got to be very patient to get, quote, value out of the carbon. As the price goes up, that changes. And someplace in the $25 to $50, you start changing that the carbon becomes more valuable than the timber. This is at a 5% discount rate. Most people that are interested in carbon management are much more patient than that. And so their discount rate would be much less. And so that line will cross at a different place. But the concept is what I wanted people to grasp, that what we pay for the price of carbon has a big impact on how we would manage the forests. And that's just the truth. And this modeling actually took it out and found that, well, people might start moving to monocultures if the price got too high. And so it's not an all or nothing perfect picture as the price goes higher. So the message I want to leave is the price will affect some of the management. Oops. So these are the choice that we have. Harvesting in a manner that keeps more carbon through conventional sustainable forestry. It keeps, you get paid for your timber, and by doing better management, you get some timber and some carbon. It's the carbon piece of that that how much of that is out of your total timber is, variable. And some of the people that have experience will talk about that. But you do get some of the timber out of it and you get some of the income out of it. The other way is reserve forests are maximizing the amount of carbon you're storing. But right now, it's not clear that that's an economic viable for a private landowner. And so that gets into, well, maybe the public lands have a bit more role there because of the fact that they're not time constrained by time or need return. So what's the balance between those strategies? Smart forestry or pro-forestation reserve type management? And that's the landowner's decision. The government's decision. That's the decision. And that's where we're having to sort out as a society is what is the right mix. Various people have different answers to that, and we will find that common ground by talking about that mix. We're not going to get there if we use all one strategy. So it's the balance. That's
So, there we go. Yep, we're good. Okay, so I'm going to move from kind of theory to practice and talk about a forest carbon program to aggregation program, meaning we took a bunch of smaller parcels and aggregated them into one big parcel for the purposes of figuring out the carbon credit picture. I was involved in setting this up on behalf of my role in Cold Hollow, Canada, but I'm also a participant in the program. We have about 1,100 acres enrolled in the program. So I have perspective from the one of the organizing entities and also from a participant. So a bit about Cold Hollow, Canada, which is an organization I'm a member of. We are a very regional, but very community-led grassroots forest conservation and stewardship organization. We live in the largest, most intact broadleaf temperate forest remaining in the world. But it's also home to 5 million people. Nowhere else in the world is this kind of forest that close to that many people. And for this reason, we set about a goal of doubling the amount of conserved forest in our region. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but you can see that we focus on some critical linkages. And there's one right here where we are. And so we're focused on trying to conserve, in particular, working forests, because we are also very community focused. What do we do? And here's where we do it. It's our sort of 7-town region and this critical linkage. We bring resources to landowners. You can see a bunch of them here. We get landowners to appreciate what they own on a landscape scale perspective. We get them to love their forests. And once they love their forests, they want to protect their forests. Once they want to protect their forests, then they're going to conserve their forests. And so that's sort of our approach to conservation. We got involved in the resource of carbon credit sales because we thought this is a resource we can bring to our landowners and to our communities. What are the benefits? Why do we get involved in this? Revenue from the carbon credits, as you've heard, it substitutes for harvest revenue. That reduces the development and subdivision pressure. Owning land is expensive, and taxes and forestry and all the rest of that. And we want families in particular to be able to hold and manage the land for generations and decades. And this is a way to provide some of the financial resources that are necessary to do that. It can fund pre-commercial practices that, you've got an even age forest that was cut it all at one time. You've got to transition it to an uneven age. You can much better biodiversity, structure, you can release, regen, all these things cost money. And so you've got to find some way to fund these pre-commercial things. We also see carbon credit programs as a possible strong inducement to enter into conservation easements, because the value of a conservation easement is higher before you go into a carbon credit program, which in itself is a form of easement. So if you're considering going into a carbon credit program, there's a financial benefit to putting your land into a conservation easement prior to doing that. And so we see that as a tool as well. So let me talk about the program. The motivation was to start up a carbon credit program is very expensive. It's very time consuming. It requires a lot of forestry technical expertise, financial, legal expertise that's beyond the capability of smaller landowners. If you're a big industrial forest landowner, you have people who know how to do this. If you own 200 acres, 400 acres, you're on your own, right? And so there's a huge barrier to entry. So back in 2018, the Vermont Land Trust with the University of Vermont, Spatial Informatics Group, got a grant to study the feasibility. Could we do this? Could we aggregate a bunch of these smaller parcels so that people who own smaller parcels would have access to the carbon credit market? And there was a study that lasted over a year, and it looked like we could probably get it done. Coal Hollow, Canada, we kind of selected the candidate landowners. This was either the first aggregation project in the United States or close to it. And so we selected landowners who are conservation minded, who would get along well with each other, who would work with each other. That was sort of the role that we had. Okay, bunch of numbers. So the project finally got going in June of 2019. Ended up with 10 landowners, about 12 parcels, 8,600 acres. So the sort of canonical thought is it takes about 5,000 acres to make all the work of setting up a carbon project worthwhile. We have one or two smaller parcels that belong to some of the folks who own the bigger parcels, but basically we targeted about 200 acres and up. So we were parcel size running from a little small now up to a couple thousand acres. So we generate about 50,000 ERTs per year, emission reduction tons. It cost more than $200,000 to get this project put together. Probably, it might have been close to twice that if you count all the staff time that went unpaid, things like that. So, that's a huge burden to obviously a small landowner. So we have in every of these carbon projects, there's a registrar that keeps track of things, certifies it. In our case, that's the American Carbon Registry. This is an improved forest management protocol. So we're going to change the way we manage our forests, right? That's where additionality comes from. Vermont Forest Carbon, which is a subsidiary of the Vermont Land Trust, with what they call the project proponent, does all the work. And then you have to account for all the carbon. That's a very technical role that Spatial Informatics Group does that. And the Nature Conservancy partners with us to actually market the credits. Since this hadn't been done before, we had to figure out how to do it. And so you get a bunch of individual landowners. What's their relationship to each other? What's their relationship to the project proponent? How does this all work? Nobody had done it before, so we had to figure it out. We looked at a bunch of different ways to do it. Co-op, we're in Vermont, we love co-ops. And so we all form a co-op, all the landowners speak jointly, but that failed. People understood that, but what happens if this guy sells his property and somebody else cuts it and not supposed to? That's called an intentional reversal. What happens then? Who does what to whom? How do we enforce this? Turned out not to really be a very feasible thing to do. So we decided that Vermont Land Trust would form a subsidiary. They would be responsible for doing everything that needed to be done. And individual landowners would then contract with that subsidiary. And so, but that subsidiary has a lot of responsibility. If you're going to propose a harvest practice, you've got to make sure it's done correctly according to the plan, according to your forest management plan. Somebody goes qualify it and certify it. Somebody's going to manage the verification. I'll talk about that in a minute, which happens every year and every 5 years. We got to report things to the carbon registry every year. You got to collect all the information from who's cut what. And then most importantly, is we'll find out, is market the credits once you have them. So VFC shares about 70% of the net revenue after all this costs with the landowners. That's kind of how it works. And should something go wrong, they have legal recourse to the landowners. So it's a contractual obligation between VFC and the landowners. So it's an American Carbon Registry Protocol additionality. You hear this word probably a number of times today. Additionality is the difference between business as usual scenario and once you've changed what you do, that difference is called additionality, right? So it's the effect of your changes, in this case, forest management practices. So the additionality in this case, and there are a bunch of these different carbon registries and they'll kind of do it just a little bit differently. It's the difference in the carbon stocking in the forest as we go forward above the baseline. The baseline is what would have happened had you maximized the value of your forest, net present value, 100-year harvest maximization. So if you would maximize the value of forest, subject to all the laws and good practices, so you can't just clear cut it. So that's not the baseline. The difference between those two is the amount of carbon, the additional amount of carbon that's in the forest that wouldn't have been there. So you have to change your forestry practices in order to obtain that. Biggest one, and you saw that on earlier slides, called extended rotation, just means not cutting the trees off. Right? That's the biggest factor. But in addition to that, and the forestry practices have to exceed the common practice in the region. Otherwise, again, you question the additionality. Species selection for biodiversity. This is particularly important in climate change. So we're going to select different species in the forest and make sure they're appropriate for the site in order for, if there's a natural disturbance, which we're seeing more of, that forest will still continue to be healthy because we have a diverse selection of species, not just one predominant one that might be valuable at the moment. We want structure complexity. We want old trees. We want young trees. We want dead wood on the ground. We want coarse woody debris. We want snags. This again leads to biodiversity and forest health. And we want additional no harvest zones. So these are riparian zones, minimal harvest zones, buffers, ESTAs, environmentally sensitive treatment areas. More of these get built into the forest management plan. So I mean, personal, our personal forest, we just completed a new 10-year forest management plan that's a requirement in Vermont under current use for this past April. It looks vastly different than it would have, than I intended 20 years ago for it to look in the absence of this carbon credit program. We talked a little bit about baseline. That's net present value maximized business unit, right? So if you're going to maximize the value of your forest, this is what the baseline is. These things are baseline durability, leakage, verification are common to all the registries. So we're going to do this. The carbon gets credited over a 20-year period, but there's a 40-year verification period. So you're making a commitment for 40 years. There are other carbon markets where it's actually a 100-year commitment. It's the voluntary market. And you're going to take 20% of the credits you create, and you put them in a buffer pool. And that buffer pool is there in case bad things happen. It's there in case you have a wildfire or, microbursts or whatever form of things nature does to reduce the carbon stock. So we're going to set aside 20% of the credits to take care of bad things. That doesn't take care of intentional reversal, which is somebody doing something that not supposed to do via the contract. There's a different mechanism for dealing with that. And the credits are issued for avoided conversion, not cutting the trees that you could have cut, and removal, the growth of the trees. So there's slightly different counting for those. So leakage is a big issue. If you start to look into carbon credits, leakage is the concept that if a forest owner owns two forests, okay, I'm going to put one forest in carbon credit program, I'm going to cut by half the amount of carbon I put, but I'm going to double the trees I cut in this other forest. That's called activity leakage. It's forbidden under these programs. There's market leakage. So if the market uptake of wood doesn't change, then all you've done is sort of move the consumption someplace else. Market leakage. And the American Carbon Registry deals with that by putting some more stuff in the buffer pool to take care of the eventuality that there's market leakage. And then, of course, verification is critical. So all this is modeling, but you've got to get out there and verify it. So we do an initial inventory, lots of test plots, tree measurements, things like that. That gets by a third party. That third party's work gets audited by yet another third party, make sure it's correct. And those verifications have to take, they run a model every year, but they have to redo the on-the-ground verification every 5 years in this registry. All right, what are the results? The net revenue to landowners running $45 to $90 per acre per year initially, and by initially I mean over the first period where the avoided conversion credits are being run down. This is above average pricing. And so you saw that graph where, the pricing has an effect on timber mill. This is above average pricing. The reason it's above average pricing is because we bring the story, if you will, to the buyers and say, this is not industrial forest management. These are individual family-owned parcels. These are forest owners who want to practice ecological forestry. These are forest owners who love their land. These are forest owners who want to keep their land in their family or who want to conserve it. This helps them to do that. That drove significantly higher pricing, at least that's our sense of it. Highly stocked parcels realize the majority of their initial income from these, so don't cut the tree credits. Moderately stocked parcels, less so. These are more growth heavy. But the net income will go down in the future years when you have to do these on-the-ground verifications. They cost sort of $100,000 a piece. And as you get past the avoided conversion credits, it goes down. We're also seeing a decline in pricing and retirements in 2024. And so we've actually got some credits that haven't been sold. And this has to do with a lot of turmoil in the carbon credit market related to some failed projects, mostly in the tropical forest areas, and a lot of uncertainty. But these issues are being dealt with by the registrars, sort of tightening up some of their protocols, and we expect that to change next year. What have we learned? What are the questions? The prices that we realize are high, but the landowners are completely subject to the market. If the price goes up, everybody's happy. If the price goes down, nobody's happy, right? So there are other approaches you're going to hear about in a moment that, sort of moderate this exposure to the market, but this is a full-on exposure to the market. So right now it's great. We don't know what the 2024 election results may or may not have consequences. There's a lot of discussion in the marketplace about avoided conversion versus removal credit pricing. We don't know how that's going to work. So the landowners have signed up for this for 40 years. And they are fully exposed to the wide variations and swings in the market. The project proponent has an enormous workload. There's just a tremendous amount of stuff to do to manage this project. Forestry expertise, accounting, financial management, marketing, all this stuff. Are land trusts or other nonprofit organizations well equipped to do that? Not the business they're in. We're in the business of conserving land. So are they the right entities to try to pursue this? Is there negative cash flow after the first 20 years? Every parcel in this aggregated group will transfer ownership within the next 40 years. Some of them might go to successor family members. Knowing the parcels, most of them won't. Some already have. Managing those transitions is very difficult. You've got to have the new owner understand the obligations of the old owner. These things go with the land. There's a lot of question and work around that. And finally, there is no organized market in the voluntary carbon credit market. There's no stock market. You can't bid and ask, right? You've got to go out and talk to organizations somehow or another. You can find the organizations that want to buy these credits and want to pay a lot for them. That's a difficult task. Do conservation nonprofits have the adequate commercial focus to do this and the capability to do this? So these are all open questions. So in sum, I'd say this model of aggregating a bunch of smaller parcels into a large project, going out in the marketplace with it, has the disadvantages that it's very time-consuming, expensive to set up. But if you find an organization willing to do it, that's great. But you're exposing the participants and landowners to the variations in the marketplace. It's the right answer for some landowners, and it's probably not the right answer for some landowners. But there are other ways to do it that you're going to hear about. That's it.
Be thinking about your question. Well, let me go. This is great too. Look.
All right, thanks everybody. John and Everett, thank you. That was a great introduction to why forests matter for climate and how carbon credits work in general. So I get to talk about the program that I work for, which is the Family Forest Carbon Program. We're a partnership between American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy. And the goal is to support family forest owners in managing their woods in ways that help mitigate climate change. I think we're all running over, so I'm going to go just a highlight reel, talk a little bit about why we have this thing, how it works, and what it means to be involved. So like John mentioned, forests are a really important part of the climate solution, right? We're not going to get out of this thing without working with our forests. And specifically in the US, family forests are essential to that. Something like 290 million acres of the US is family forests owned by families, individuals. That makes this the largest ownership class in the country. 39% of American forests, and I think, John, you mentioned up to 80% forests here in New England. That's more than corporations, more than the states, more than the feds. And it's not just a big area. Something on the order of 20 or 21 million people own a forest in the US. That's 1 in 4 rural Americans. So this is a huge body of land, a huge group of people who care about their land. Right? They want it to stay forested, want it to be healthy and productive, not just today, but into the future. And luckily, those are goals that align really well with managing your forest with climate in mind. Everett mentioned a little bit about barriers to accessing market, right? People really want to invest time and energy in their forests to make them more healthy and productive, right? But they need incentives, right? They need the financial means to do so. And those do exist to some extent, right? We have government-funded assistance. We have conservation programs like EQIP and WIP. We have some state and federally funded conservation easements. We have tax incentives like the current use program. But those by themselves, and even when combined with private philanthropy, just aren't enough if you're really trying to have an impact on the climate through forest management. And so where we look is to the market, specifically to the market for carbon offsets. We think that when it's used right, it's a really effective mechanism to encourage people to take voluntary action to improve their forests and sequester carbon at a really large scale. So despite the potential of family forests to have a big climate impact, right, most folks are completely underserved by that market. This chart here shows distribution of ownership sizes, and then the percent of carbon projects within that size class. As you can see, like most forest land is owned by small landowners, but most carbon projects currently occur on large ownerships. Most of them over properties over 5,000 acres in size. For reference, the average landowner in the Northeast owns about 67 acres. Right, so there's a huge mismatch there. That's pretty obvious why I never mentioned them, right? The first is it's wicked expensive. It's a few $100,000. And a lot of those costs are fixed. And when you spread those costs across a small number of acres, it really quickly becomes infeasible. The second is that it's really hard, right? It's really complex. Large professionalized ownerships have people like foresters, lawyers, people who can do things for them, right? Collect data, write reports, develop contracts. And that stuff is just out of reach for most private landowners. So, enter the Family Forest Carbon Program. What we're trying to do with this thing is to reduce those barriers to entry that Everett mentioned, I kind of built on there, and create really viable opportunities for landowners to create new income streams for themselves while managing their forests well, which will mitigate climate change and improve the health of their woods. I'm going to go into some detail about it, but just really basically here's how it works. We enter into contracts with forest landowners, and we pay them specifically to manage their forests in ways that have been shown to enhance climate mitigation and resilience. And if you look at the back, there's a book, The Healthy Forest for the Future Guide. A lot of what we offer is based on the prescriptions that are in that book. So what that means is not only increasing carbon sequestration and storage, but also increasing the forest's ability to withstand change and environmental stress. That management will result in an increase in carbon storage compared with land that isn't enrolled in the program. We measure that difference and then sell that and use that to fund the program and pay more landowners to take care of the woods. So we're a conservation nonprofit, right? We only have this program to have a positive impact on the climate and the forest, right? That's what we're here for. We're not here to sell carbon credits. We use carbon credits as the fuel for the engine to drive the climate impact we're trying to have. And because of that, we're really sort of foundationally committed to making sure that what we produce has, it's both credible and has a real benefit to the climate and to the forest. And so we've developed a new way of generating the carbon credits. Is a methodology, is sort of the term they use for the ways that you make carbon credits. We think that that's going to increase the accuracy of the calculations and the claims, and also make it much cheaper and allow us to apply it to small properties like we do. The other half of that, of course, is that's how you make the carbon credits. The other half is how you sell them. We want to make sure that the products, that the stuff that we do, is used in ways that actually add to the climate solution. And don't just greenwash for corporations who couldn't be bothered to take the actions they need to take to reduce their emissions. So we vet all our buyers and we make sure that the companies that we sell to are really taking a comprehensive approach to their climate goals, right? First, avoiding emissions and then reducing them. And only those really kind of sticky residual emissions that they can't eliminate, that's what we allow them to offset by buying our carbon credits. So I mentioned the methodology. Here's generally how it works, right? first thing we do is we collect forest inventory data on properties that are enrolled in our program. This is one of the most expensive parts of the process, right? And it represents one of the biggest barriers to entry for small landowners. The way that we're able to do this to really reduce costs for smallholders is to take every landowner who enrolls in our program in a single year. We call that a cohort. We take all those landowners who enrolled 1 year and we sample across all of that cohort as though it were an individual property, right? That reduces the number of plots on any individual property, right? It's reducing the cost. But on the cohort level, on essentially the large project level, it retains that statistical rigor you need to be able to generate a carbon credit. So then once we've collected that data, we take that and we match that with data that's collected by the US Forest Service. The Forest Service has this network of plots all across the country on public and private land. They call it FIA, Forest Inventory and Analysis. Those plots are pretty regularly distributed and they're monitored regularly. So it really gives an accurate, up-to-date set of information on forest conditions out there in the landscape that's not enrolled in FFCP. So we take our plot data and we compare that to the plot data the Forest Service collects and we match it to the most similar plots. We use, I think, 14 or 15 variables, right? Forest type, ecoregion, stand origin, stand age, slope, elevation, distance to road, regen, commercial stocking, species mix, the whole bit, right? We truly try to isolate membership in the Family Forest Carbon Program as the thing that differentiates our plots, our treatment plots from the control, from FIA. Those treatment plots, those plots, the FIA plots we match to ours, those are what we call the baseline. That's what we use to be able to create our case for additional. So once that baseline is established, we measure our plots again. Forest Service measures their plots. We compare them. We measure our plots. Forest Service measures their plots, and we compare them. We do that over and over again across the 20-year contract. And over time, right, as the improved forest management practices on properties that are enrolled in the program result in more sequestered and stored carbon than properties that are not enrolled in the program. We can quantify that additional carbon. That's the gray area in between those two lines, and generate carbon credits based just on that delta, just on that additional. So in any 1 year, right, a property who's enrolled in the program might harvest timber per our guidelines, and it might get matched to a property that doesn't harvest timber, and so we'll see a decline for that property. Or our property doesn't harvest timber, it gets matched to one that does, and we'll see a really big jump. So on any one property, it's spiking. But if you think across the whole landscape, right, hundreds and hundreds of ownerships, it does tend to smooth out. And so you can sort of see the carbon dynamic like this, right, on the FFCP landscape in green and the baseline in yellow. And you'll also, what I think is really important to note, is that even if unenrolled forests on the landscape are actually growing and increasing in their carbon stocks, which is what's happening here in New England as the forest recovers from hundreds of years of agriculture, we reflect that in our calculations, right? And we're only generating carbon credits on what's truly additional, right? The carbon that's stored on enrolled properties because of membership in the Family Forest Carbon Program. So we're really trying to not make claims based on history, based on the standing stocks of the property. And we're not trying to make guesses about what's going to happen in the future because we got no idea what's going to happen. All we do is measure and claim the real and tangible climate benefit from enrolling in the program as that benefit occurs on the landscape. Just a pretty new way of doing it, right? We think it has a number of benefits to landowners. Because of the way it's structured, because we pay landowners for forest management rather than for carbon, the payments we offer are guaranteed. Right? It's not tied to a specific carbon outcome. It's tied to a commitment to forest management practices. So if landowner does it successfully, they get paid. And we take AFF, we take all the risk that we did our math right, essentially, and the carbon shows up. So the payments differ by specific activity, but we pay between $200 and $360 per acre across the entire 20-year contract. Right? So that's between $10 and $18 per acre per year. And I can get into the specifics of what those practices are in the questions, but I know I've got only a couple more minutes. But we also, I should mention all this stuff is free. All of the measurements, all of the enrollment costs, that is all borne by the organization. Since we're also really committed to supporting landowners in achieving their forest management goals, we are offering ongoing technical support along with the financial assistance. We will write a management plan for landowners who don't have one, or we will pay the landowner or the consulting forester to amend or update that plan so they can sort of be guided through the whole 20-year relationships they have with it. Also because the program is really rooted in active forest stewardship. The landowners that we contract with, our hope is that they're going to be able to manage their forest for the long term for a variety of goals like John mentioned, right? Not only managing for carbon, but managing for wood products, managing for habitat, and doing that over the long run at a higher and growing carbon basis is going to have a climate solution as well as provide all the other things that we love from forests. That's the Family Forest Carbon Program. Like I said, it was just a highlight reel. There's lots more detail, and we'll have time to chat about it later. How do we do this one to turn it off?
Yeah, you just leave it alone. Thank you so much.
Next.
Yeah, I'm here.
Spark.
Yep, here I am.
Jessica
Jessica
Barkowski.
Manowski, excuse me, sorry.
That's okay. No worries. Thanks for accommodating the remote session. Yeah, Dan got sick. Sorry, everybody. So I'm going to need someone to advance my slides. Thank you for being here, everybody. I really appreciate your time. I'm just going to wait for our slides to come up. I am with Forest Carbon Works. Yep, that's the one. And I am the New England Regional Forester. So I work with landowners throughout the Northeast. Forest Carbon Works tries to make it, accessible for landowners to access the carbon market. One thing we heard about already tonight was that it is difficult for private landowners to access the carbon market. And we try to strive to make that more streamlined for any landowner. And we have on-staff foresters who work with landowners as well as consulting foresters. That's part of my job is to work with consulting foresters to make sure that management plans, whether they're in 480A or Vermont current use, or any of the tree growth programs in Maine, are compatible with our program. So that is an on staff resource we have for landowners. This is an emerging market, as we've heard from a number of people tonight as well. But we do have quite a bit of experience in the market. We started from EP Carbon in 2016, and we are now owned by Chestnut Carbon, which gives us a lot of stability in the market. We have over 14 million acres globally enrolled in compliance and voluntary markets. And we have currently a team of 45 professional forestry and carbon analysts in the United States. And we have a proprietary carbon inventory approach that streamlines the forest inventory, which everybody knows is like a really demanding and time-consuming part of this process, is to get boots on the ground, measure the trees, measure the carbon coming in. So that is something that's unique as well. I'm going to just really briefly go over this because it's already been talked about. I think the main takeaway is that family forest owners do have a huge say in how our forests are managed. We have changing demographics, forest ownership. I think the average age of forest owner is 60 or 65, and that's great. But it does sort of put pressure on if people are going to sell or if they're going to conserve it, or what that change is going to look like in the next 20 to 30 years. So we try to offer an alternative to some passive income through conservation. And this slide is about carbon credits. Are they working? So this is a question I get a lot. And it is sort of a new market as far as voluntary carbon credits go. But research from Trove suggests that companies that invest in quality carbon credits do decarbonize twice as fast as companies that do not. And the quality of those carbon credits are really important. And as a company, we strive to make sure that our credits are the highest as possible. So back to our program. We have about, oh, this is changing every day. I think it's closer to 100,000 acres right now, but it gives you an idea of where we have our enrollments. A lot of it is on the coasts, but we have some in the Midwest, northern Midwest as well. And we have about 3,000 landowners currently applying, a little over 100,000 acres in the program. But the funny thing is, the average size of our landowner is only 200 acres. So we really do work with, smaller private landowners for our program. And as I mentioned earlier, we're really striving to improve access to the market through competitive payments, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about how that's structured. The permanence and co-benefits with the longer commitments. We have about a 60-year commitment total, which I'm also going to go into. And we have a really experienced team that's broken up into regional teams, even though we're national, because there's so much regional variation in forest systems. We feel that that's really important. And we try to streamline the process for landowners because it can be a confusing and sort of complicated process at times. So we want to work with, the landowner through the entire membership process. So yeah, here are the details that I mentioned we were going to discuss. So we have a 40-acre minimum to participate. There's no maximum, but we do tend to focus on landowners with smaller acreage sizes. We are available throughout the U.S. We do not have a specificity based on forest types, so we enroll all forest types. We have a 6-year contract with a 25-year payment period, meaning you get payments every year, followed by a 35-year monitoring period. And we are not a harvest deferral program. We do set aside some stocking that's called uncredited reserve stock. So you're allowed to harvest up to 10% for forest health purposes. And then that harvest flexibility also increases during the 35-year monitoring period, as long as you maintain what we call permanent stock that was credited for. And that's definitely something that's communicated between that transition of the 25-year payment period to the 35-year monitoring period. We pay an average of $10 an acre, but it's based on what we call VCUs, so that's verified credit units. And that's calculated based on productivity of your site, and then some risk assessment is subtracted from that. But that's as well, communicated before any contracts are signed. It's often in the Northeast around $12 an acre. And we do offer some harvest, and we have FSC certification available. And of course, we're third party approved and verified through Vera. This is just, I think we can also skip over this because it's already been discussed a little bit, just how we calculate the baseline. It's important to us to show additionality, which means that the project is doing something that wouldn't have been there, which is, the business as usual. So that is really important for what we call additionality, and that's sort of built into our methodology. So yeah, it's already been talked about, but yeah. So if anybody is interested, it's really easy to apply. As I said, we strive to sort of make sure that this is accessible. You can go on our website, fill out an application. We have membership advisors that will contact you really quickly, usually in a couple of days. Then your application is reviewed. Part of that is a forester review. So we make sure your acreage is correct. And then if you have a forest management plan or a tax program or a conservation easement, it gets sent to me or Dan, and we review that to make sure it's compatible with our program. And then we send you an initial offer. And then once you accept that offer through conversation, you're enrolled in the program and you receive your first payment in 30 days. And then we come out to your property just once every 5 years, really, but initially once to do an on-the-ground inventory to verify your carbon stocks. We have an initial assessment that informs your initial offer, but we feel it's important to do an on-the-ground assessment as well. And then all you have to do after that is complete a really short annual survey in case there's any changes to your property, like a natural disaster or anything else that may have happened, in which case we do have a buffer pool for that. The landowner's never responsible for a natural disaster, but we just need to know what's going on with your property. It takes about 10 minutes to fill out. And you receive annual payments for that payment period. And these are some of our real landowners. And Dan was going to give a story about Charles Appel, but he's not here today. And I actually haven't met him. He does more of the forest inventory. And all I can say is I have done a couple carbon walks and talks with our members, and they're all super excited about the program. They're really diverse and they enter for a number of different reasons. But some of the overlying factors are they really care about their legacy. They're very conservation minded and they want to make sure that it makes financial sense, for their children and legacy and offsetting tax bills and things like that. So yeah, that's what they all seem to have in common, as well as being super open to doing carbon walks. We do some throughout the year. So yeah, you can check our website if you're interested in one of those. I think the last slide just has our contact information on it. You can reach out to myself or Dan or visit our website if you're interested in filling out an application or getting started or just asking a question. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So Russ, questions and answers?
Yeah, let's get to some Q&A because we only have a little bit of time. Why don't we have the presenters roll into the center here? We'll get you in the hot seat and I'm going to get the ball rolling, but I'd like to invite questions from members of the audience. If we run out of time, maybe you can accost them before they get to the door and get your question in after we hit the end of the hour. First question, by the way, brilliant program you put together here. I mean, amazing. Really, really cool. And amazing education to see the big picture, get the big picture from John, get the story about the bespoke effort, Everett, which sounds amazing, but then also learn about how small landowners might participate in the same kind of thing from the last two presenters. So first, let me just ask you, Everett, you said the first thing you try to do is teach landowners how to love their forest. How do you do that? I mean, quick.
We have a program called the Woodlots program, where we bring landowners together that are in the same town usually. We have potlucks and we bring resources and we go on woods walks and we explain on a landscape scale how important these forests are for wildlife, for species diversity, water quality, all the attributes of forest. And that's a learning process that occurs over a few years, but it's a very strong process.
It sounds fun. I mean, do you have to teach the love?
No, people come to.
They already love the love. They already have the love. Just interested in that. We learned about basically two outfits that assist small landowners. In Jessica's case, people with 40 acres. And what's the
Minimum 30 acres.
30 acres for you. So we learned about two actions. Are there other organizations that are also trying to allow small landowners to participate in these, realizing revenues through selling?
Yes, the market is growing. There's programs coming online all the time. Yeah. Some of them are regionally focused. Some of them are focused specifically on reforestation or afforestation. But yeah, it's growing.
All right, John?
Yeah, just one question or a comment that both of the organizations we have here, Forest Carbon Works and the American Forest, are certified in New Hampshire, and they're the only ones certified in New Hampshire. So each state does a certification process, I think, or some states do. So that's one of the reasons we have.
And is there any hope for landowners with fewer than 30 acres to participate? Is that just too small to? No.
So for us, 30 acres, the way we set our limit was sort of a combination of essentially like what we could afford. I mentioned we reduce the costs and sort of spread them out, but at some point there is a limit there. We were also trying to find the sweet spot between that and what is the smallest woodlot that you could actually support and support ongoing timber management that can apply some of the climate smart prescriptions that we're setting up. So that's where we got at 30 acres. Would we like to get smaller? Yes, and we're working on a pilot for specifically for landowners who own as few as 10 acres in some places where harvest pressures is a bit higher. But yeah, that's still in R&D.
Interesting. Yes.
Russ, as you know, the Appalachian Trail runs through Hanover. The National Park Service purchased land. Now, the trail goes through a lot of private land. And the Park Service, in our case, as an example, ours was 70 acres. We settled with them and shared 22 acres and we owned 48 outright. But getting to your point of smaller parcels, does the National Park Service participate in this program? And if so, if a landowner doesn't, could they participate along with the part of the Appalachian Trail that goes through their property?
So the two questions there, right? One, can federal land get enrolled in our program? The short answer to that is no, right? We're only working with private landowners. Where landowners have access easements, we want to take a look at it to make sure that it's not otherwise like encumbering the ability to manage for timber rights because it reduces the case for additionality. But yeah, it's possible.
Do they participate already?
Who?
The National Park Service
No,
with the land that they own?
no, we only work with private
I
land.
mean, are they selling carbon?
Right.
Are they?
Generally, I think the answer is no to that. There are Oregon and I think there's one other state is the state are trying to do carbon credits, but in general, it's private land.
Yeah, sounds like an interesting, different path for legislators to take up.
Yeah, the American Carbon Registry specifically excludes federal lands.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's similar to our program as well. So we do only work with private landowners, but we can exclude areas that are under conservation easement or anything like that.
And we have a questioner on the chat. Chair.
We actually have many in Zoom. The first is Nina's asking, are there tax benefits to do this, state or federal?
Tax benefits.
There are not tax benefits specifically for this, but our program is, at least some of the practices we offer are compatible with state current use tax programs. That's the major tax benefits you get from maintaining forest land.
Anne is making a related question. Are payments made to landowners for carbon offsets taxable?
Yes, their income.
Their income. Yeah.
The IRS is sort of not completely decided whether it's ordinary income or capital gains. Right now, they're treating it as ordinary income, but there's some question.
Interesting. Can you help me with the idea of a 60-year contract? 'Cause I mean, it seems like a long time, especially for somebody who's over 50 to contract for 60 years. What does that mean? I mean, does that mean like the land is entailed for all that period? The grandchildren are going to be dealing with that. Are there, is there an exit option if the grandchildren don't want this contract that grandpa signed? 60 years just seems like a long time for they don't have 60-year mortgages.
But they do have forever easements. So it's coming off of the experience in the land trust world of easements are contracts basically forever. And so you're seeing owners have to live by that easement. You can't undo it. Carbon contracts are just another
I see. So
aspect.
Yeah,
there is-
it goes with the land as well. It's an encumbrance on the property. So it can be transferred. It's not necessarily an encumbrance on the person, it's on the property.
Yes, there is the ability to get out of the contracts. Everyone does it differently. If you get out of a contract, that represents a loss of those credits to the market. We have to replace at the then current value, right? And so if a landlord wants to terminate the contract voluntarily, we require they repay the value of what those credits would be or benefits.
So you can come up with a price or something, an exit price. Interesting.
I saw a quick reference in one of the presentations to the results of the 2024 election. It appears the president-elect is not on board with global warming initiatives. Could the money for these carbon offsets dry up?
So great question. Couple of questions, right? Couple of things there. One, we started the program during the first Trump administration, and I think, well, it's my own. I think we succeed despite any government, not because of. So that's thing one. Thing two, we do have some federal funding. I should mention this. Some of our startup funding comes through the federal government, specifically through a big grant that New England Forestry Foundation got. That's all obligated, and so we're not worried about any of that going away. Future funding for this sort of work, who knows, right? But again, like, we're going to succeed no matter what.
These are,
Yeah, and I would also add to that if I can. I'm sorry if I'm interrupting. It's all on Zoom. I would say a lot of the voluntary market is also driven by the consumer demand, right? So the consumers want to see that these companies are reducing emissions through reliable ways. So I don't think that really is directly related to the administration. It's more consumer demand. So I would agree with the statements that have already been made and what consumers want to see going forward.
So Jessica, that means like when I buy a plane ticket, they'll say, if you want to offset some of the carbon that this flight's going to create, here's some offsets you could pay for at the point of sale. Does that help keep creating a demand, aggregate demand that you're using to pay your, forest owners, essentially?
That's one example. Sorry, I really apologize for my internet. That's one example. But another example is just companies want to show that they are reducing their emissions. And they want to show that they're voluntarily reducing their emissions. We're not under compliance market here. And consumers respect that and see that. And companies are looking for quality carbon credits. So if we're supplying those quality carbon credits, they're buying them and they're increasing their consumer demand.
Thank you. Everett, you want to jump in?
I was just saying, same point. This is the voluntary market, so the credits are purchased primarily by corporations, in some cases by individuals who are free to make whatever decision they're going to make outside of the influence of the government. However, if we have cultural shifts, that's where things could change, and no one knows.
Thank you.
So these are all very long contracts in an emerging market. And you all are selling programs to participate. So as a landowner, should I do that now or should I wait?
Any thoughts?
Loads of thoughts. I don't know. But what I can tell you, so specifically the way we work, we don't contract for carbon, right? We carbon rights are transferred as part of it. What we pay landowners for is a forest management strategy, right? And if that forest management strategy fits with your goals for the forest, it'll fit now or it'll fit later. So that's what I would say to that.
So who advises the landowner on what they should do financially?
Who advises the landowner? The landowner's friends and lawyer and forester and better half.
Yeah, your consulting forester would be.
Yeah. I agree. The consulting forester, I really like working with landowners, consulting foresters, because they have a better picture of the property. They have insight on what the landowner wants for management objectives. I mean, as far as financial incentives, that might be a financial advisor, but from a forestry perspective, I love working with landowners and their consulting forester for these.
Does that help with your question? Back row?
Yeah, I have a question about the buffer pool. So one of you mentioned the idea of putting aside some of the carbon credits to protect against natural disasters and other declines in the carbon. Does that feel to you all like it's an effective strategy? Are the buffer pools large enough, especially in light of kind of large scale forest fires in this country?
I can hear a question. So is the buffer pool big enough? The buffer pool is what we're stuck with for now, right? Everybody has to put into it different amounts depending on the project type, the registry, and all that. It assumes that we kind of know what the rate of reversal will be, and in natural systems, it's a big spread, right? You go out west, the buffer pool has been depleted for some projects because it's burning. In the east, the buffer pool is probably way too much, right? And so there are some moves afoot to create a new kind of, not a buffer pool, but almost like a trust for permanence. That's almost sort of based on insurance and what it would cost to create truly permanent storage on the back of sort of natural systems sequestration and storage that would make sure that we have the resources there to replenish it that isn't necessarily a fixed amount and doesn't guess at how much that amount's going to be. Does that make sense? But it's not, it doesn't exist yet, but it's like something like it's the next big thing.
I think we can squeeze another question from the chat.
Well, could I just add to that actually? So at Forest Carbon Works, we might have a slightly different approach, but it is based on our methodology for the buffer pool, and we have a national aggregate. So it does disperse some of the risk from what you're saying about regional differences based on, you know, wildfire versus flooding versus blowdowns. So it is dispersed, and we have a regional, or I'm sorry, we have a national pool because we work nationwide. So that's how our buffer pool works, and we do feel that it's adequate.
Thank you. Chat.
Someone is asking, are there any examples of land trusts that have participated in this? And please explain what, if any, downside might be the case for a land trust that has conservation easements in place.
Can a land trust participate in this or
That's an easy answer.
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah.
It's the other part of the answer that gets more complex, but yes, they're private owners, so they can. But it all gets focused on the intentionality of that land originally, and so is there any additional carbon that you're really selling? And that's where there's a lot of gray and a lot of discussion. And
Right. Who showed the slide that said do the easement first and then?
Yeah, so for maximizing the value of the conservation easement, which is either a tax benefit or if it's a compensated easement, it's a payment, you want to enter into the conservation easement prior to entering into a carbon credit arrangement, because that could reduce the value of the conservation easement.
We're going to stop here. Let me just invite, are there any final thoughts? Jessica, let me turn to you first. You're on the screen.
Yeah, I slightly disagree with that. Not to, you know, deny what you're saying. We are compatible with conservation easements as long as they allow timber harvesting. So if it's a no development easement, that's fine. If it's a forever wild easement, we can't do it because it doesn't show additionality. But if you're already in a no development easement, then that does not affect crediting at all. So it doesn't matter if you enter it first or after or whenever.
Yeah, it
And
doesn't affect
yes,
carbon
land-
crediting, I agree.
So land trusts can enter into our program. One barrier I found is that we do require all forest land under one owner to be enrolled. And some land trusts have so much land and they have different objectives that it's difficult for them to be able to do that. That's the one barrier I found working with land trusts.
Quick question, yes or no? What if you share the land and tap the maple trees? Does that affect anything?
No. I mean, you can tap maple trees. Yeah.
That's the most important question.
Yeah, I mean, we all like maple syrup, right? Like, we're not taking away the maple syrup. Don't put that on us. Yeah.
So we're stopping now, and I just want to say a couple of things, and then we'll thank you and also thank the panel and for coming here. But there's a sign-up sheet here if you want to get further information about this, about other programs we're having. Please feel free, it's back there. There's also the materials that are available. This will be online, in a few days, recorded for any of your friends that want to see it or if you'd rather watch it again. And I just want to give the group here a hand. Thank you. Being such a great, quiet audience and engaged. I hope this was helpful to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.